Okay, so my project that I will be presenting is called Credibility in the Courtroom, a Standardized Procedure or Guessing Game. And this project came out of St. Mary's University in Nova Scotia, Canada, with myself and Dr. Meg Ternes. So just some definitions so we can move forward so that we're all kind of on the same page. Credibility can be defined as the quality of being believed and trusted in. So if you might have a high credibility rating, if you can really be believed and trusted in either what you're saying or what you're doing. And credibility assessments, on the other hand, are generally done by a judge or an adjudicator in court. And it involves gathering information about an individual, whether that be a witness or a defendant, and then using that information in line with the contextual information to decide whether to accept their claims as truthful. So to assess credibility, the main way to do this is through deception detection. However, the previous research on our abilities to detect deception aren't very positive. So in 2006, Bond et al. Found that our ability to detect lies actually falls at about 50%. So basically just flipping a coin is how we're able to accurately detect deception or not. And how we do this is through looking at cues that people elicit. So it's been found that verbal cues such as what you say or your consistency, they have been found to be the most reliable way to detect deception, whereas nonverbal cues such as behavioral and personal are only really weak predictors of deceit. However, it's been found that behavioral cues are usually what's most used in the general population to detect deception. So it's not hard to see why we might be very poor at detecting deception because we're not really using the cues that are shown to be the most reliable way. When it comes to judges, however, we often think that they might be like human lie detectors and they likely have a really good ability to detect lies. But it's been found that they don't. They actually have a very similar accuracy rating of being able to detect deception as the general population, which is 50%, like I said. And the reasons for this are likely the same. It's been found that judges' beliefs on what cues are accurate are really inconsistent with what are. And among judges, there's a big lack of consistency regarding what cues are reliable. So in 2009, two researchers did a study at a conference that involved just judges, and they handed out a survey that allowed them to rank popular cues to deception as to what they thought was most reliable and what they thought was least reliable. And there was almost no consistency whatsoever. So, which kind of shows that it suggests that judges are not really aware of what cues to use when assessing credibility in court. Additionally, there are also gender differences when it comes to assessing credibility in court. Men are generally perceived to be more credible than women, probably because there are specific characteristics of men that are characteristic of men that lead to higher perceived credibility. So, for example, men are generally seen to be more trustworthy than women, and men generally have an assertive nonverbal communication style and a deeper pitched voice. All of these characteristics are not really that of a woman, stereotypically, which can lead to men being perceived as more credible. In addition, women tend to be more emotional and easier to read in a courtroom, which would allow for more behavioral and personal cues to shine through rather than verbal cues. So the purpose of this present study was to investigate how judges come to their credibility decisions, compare this to the previous literature on what methods are reliable, and then to determine if judges are using the proper and reliable methods of doing this in court. From this study, we developed two hypotheses. The first one was that behavioral and personal factors will be used to assess credibility more often than verbal factors. And in regard to gender differences, we hypothesized that women will be assessed on more average credibility factors than men and will include more behavioral and personal factors rather than verbal. So to do this study, we used an online database called canly.org, and it houses written judicial decisions from across Canada. So these cases were reviewed by a team of coders, and if they involved a credibility assessment, they were coded for. So they were coded for 19 verbal factors, 7 behavioral, and 9 personal. And the sample currently includes 587 credibility assessments across 9 provinces and 3 territories. 322 of these cases involve men, 252 involve women, and 13 involve gender not specified. Here is a summary of what credibility factors we're looking at. So some example of verbal cues involve how detailed their story was or how consistent they were. Behavioral cues, if they were maintaining eye contact, if they were fidgeting, and some personal factors that we looked at involved their intelligence or their attractiveness or their age. So the results of our study really contradicted the previous literature on what factors judges use to assess credibility. We found that verbal cues are actually used far more often than personal or behavioral cues when doing this in court. And at least one verbal cue was present in 96.7% of all of the cases that we looked at, whereas behavioral and personal cues, their prevalence was about 9.3 and 37.3% respectively. So there's a big difference in the amount in the category of cues that are used, and it's a very significant and noticeable difference in how many verbal factors are used compared to the other two. In addition, when you look at the comparisons of credibility cues and coupling them together, we found that judges tend to only really use behavioral and personal factors when they're coupled with verbal. So as you can see, the only verbal and behavioral, and verbal and personal lines, they are more prominent than the other ones, and they happen far more often than, for example, just using behavioral and personal factors, which, as you can see on the slide, did not happen at all in any of the cases in the sample. And in fact, cases that did not include at least one verbal cue actually only made up less than 3% of the entire sample. In regard to gender differences, we ran a chi-square based on the amount of each credibility factor that were used in all of the cases compared to males and females. And there was no significant difference, which helps to suggest that there isn't really a big difference between the way judges in Canada assess the credibility of a man versus how they assess the credibility of a woman. So in conclusion, this research contradicts previous literature on what factors judges use to determine credibility. Based on the lit review, one would assume that judges are really not great at assessing credibility, but this research really helped to show that maybe they are using reliable techniques, even though that's not what we previously thought. And as well, like I said before, there was no significant difference in the way men and women were evaluated when their credibility was assessed. So for the strengths and limitations of this study, there are a few notable strengths, such as this study had a very large sample size, and it included all relevant cases across 8 provinces and 3 territories. In terms of viewing credibility assessments and how judges do these and if they do them reliable, it's a relatively new area of research, and these findings that contradict previous literature will just help to really move this area of research along. And for limitations, there were 2 very notable limitations. First, cases from the province of Quebec and Ontario either had to be omitted or only partially coded for. So for Quebec, many of the written judicial decisions are written in the French language. So not being bilingual myself, it's difficult to code for those. And for Ontario, just because of time restraints, they were not able to be fully coded for. However, we are working toward getting those done. And most importantly, judicial decisions are self-reported by judges. So They really have the ability to decide what they write down and to decide what to say they use when assessing credibility. Just because judges are saying that they're using all these reliable verbal cues doesn't necessarily mean that they're not using behavioral or personal cues and just not writing them down. So that is a big limitation to this study as well. For future research, there's a couple areas that we'd like to research. First, we're currently working on including all of the omitted cases so we can have a really representative sample of all the cases in Canada. And once this is done, it would be really interesting to compare this to other countries to see if judges in other parts of the world use similar methods when they assess credibility. Additionally, comparing Supreme Court and provincial court judges would be of interest. Generally, higher court judges receive more credibility training and professional development training on issues like this. So for the lower circuit judges, it would be interesting to see if they use different or less reliable methods when assessing credibility. And lastly, federal refugee protection cases is a really intriguing area to study in regard to credibility assessments, because in these cases, oftentimes a positive rating of credibility might be the only thing or the most important thing that will grant you refugee protection in Canada. However, there is abundance of research that shows that this process is really flawed and really arbitrary when it comes to this specific population. So doing a similar study with those populations would be very interesting. And if you would like any more information about this study, you can reach out at my email on the screen. Thank you.